Walnuts run.
I have that guy's trainer. And you know the other guy you have? I have as part of the future.
Who? I'm sorry, but like, Caleb, you're a fucking brat. I have to put on my headphones because you're so rude, Caleb. Like, you really are. Like, I'll be telling you not to do something, and you always do it. Like, you're getting older, Caleb. Don't be shocked when violence become more and more abundant in your life. You understand? You didn't even say sorry. See what I mean? And you continued. You said one thing, and then you said something else when I'm making a face at you. Like, I'm your parent. You don't respect me. You don't have no respect, Caleb. Like, you're just weird. I did not mean to hit you, Caleb. I apologize. See the difference? Because I literally didn't mean it. If I did, I would have did it hard or on purpose or not apologize. You could literally tell by the force I used. It's very tight. The odds of me not hitting you there are slim to none. I gotta really try, and I'm holding a laptop, so. Like I said, you make no money, you have no skills. Everyone at your age that does a sport is probably 3 times or 5 times. Like Caleb, on Caleb, I can go on the list. I love you, Caleb. What?
Barely anybody plays this overpass.
I said who is in league. Do you see those kids on TV? How close are you to them? Right, you're not very close, right? You're like 10%, right? If I'm being nice, 10% is nice, right? 1/10 of the way there. 3 times my ass. You're not 1/3 of them. That means you're kind of close, right? It's like at least like 1 in 10, maybe 1 in 20, right? Come on, dude. How much effort you think those kids put every day? At least 20 minutes, probably. They don't do it every day, but they probably do like an hour every day. They do like 5 days, 6 days a week. Yeah, right? Come on. On their own. Nobody got to tell them shit. That's part of the culture too, bro. You know what I mean? They're putting in the work. That's their coach.
some dispute with at least one other nation in the area. But it is the disputed maritime territory between China and the Philippines that got the most attention from Beijing. Compared to the might of the Chinese Navy, the Philippines really don't have much to offer by themselves, but they do lay claim to a number of uninhabited shoals in the... Well, let's add a bit of context, shall we? You see,
Oh, he wished himself to be evil, pretty much.
China has been focused on demonstrating its maritime power in the South Indo-Pacific region. It's a funny choice of words there, rules-based order, but it was a message with precisely one intended recipient, and in the wake of India's new bilateral agreement, that intended recipient confirmed that they had heard the message loud and clear, and of course, that would be China. And if it isn't yet clear why India's agreement with the Philippines is big news, well, context, shall we? You see, China has been focused on demonstrating its maritime power in the South China Sea for years, and especially since the summer of 2023 when it released and then began abiding by its own self-created map that added quite a bit of disputed territory to the waters that it claims to control. Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Brunei, and Taiwan all claim waters in the South China Sea that are a matter of some dispute with at least one other nation in the area. But it is the disputed maritime territory between China and the Philippines that got the most attention from Beijing. Compared to the might of the Chinese Navy, the Philippines really don't have much to offer by themselves, but they do lay claim to a number of uninhabited shoals in the disputed waters, as well as spots where Philippine troops are stationed, and they do their best to patrol those waters and reinforce maritime claims despite aggressive action from China. Over the last several years, China's Navy, its Coast Guard, and its shadowy maritime militia have harassed Philippine vessels, blockaded their shoals, rammed ships on multiple occasions, and otherwise made themselves a bit of a menace for their less powerful adversary to deal with. Although the Philippines drew diplomatic support from the United States, they're basically on their own in the waters of the South China Sea, where China has learned by now that it can basically bully Manila at will. But for India to throw its support behind the Philippines, not just in theory, but in the form of military exercises and weapons deliveries, is a major rebuke to China in a largely symbolic battle that China really cares about. India's navy still isn't nearly the size of China's maritime forces. China's navy sails over 100 combined destroyers and frigates. Its most formidable Coast Guard ships are absolutely massive, and its maritime militia can leverage many hundreds of smaller vessels to engage in legally dubious encounters with rival ships by using technically non-military vessels of their own. But compared to what the Philippines were packing, India is a far more serious challenge for China to have to deal with. It sails a pair of aircraft carriers, including the indigenously built INS Vikrant, plus over a dozen destroyers, over a dozen frigates, and all the requisite support ships to sustain a group of combat vessels deployed, hypothetically speaking, to the South China Sea. And not only that, but China would have to be far more careful about risking potential escalation in confrontations with Indian ships than in confrontations with their Philippine counterparts. If China, let's say, sends a destroyer to ram a fishing trawler so hard it's broken in half and its crew on board are killed, the most that the Philippines could do in retaliation would be to try and gain some sort of reparations using diplomatic means. Beijing does not have to fear military action from Manila. India, however, is a fellow nuclear-armed nation with a recent history of both border skirmishes with China and intense short conflicts with nuclear-armed Pakistan. China cannot bully India in the same way that it can bully the Philippines, and China knows it. In the wake of India's joint maritime exercises, China accused the Philippines of undermining regional peace by drawing in outside powers, basically insinuating that the Philippines had gone running for help rather than do what China insisted was the right thing to directly resolve their disputes without any outside intervention. But it's telling in its own way that before, during, and after the drills and new agreements between Manila and New Delhi, China focused its public criticisms pretty much exclusively on the Philippines. It's India, of course, that's actually introducing this new X factor for China to perceive as a threat. But to hear China tell it, it's the meddling Philippines, the troublemaking Philippines, that are ruining China's preferred order of things in the South China Sea. And for India, it is important to note that while this may be the most assertive action that New Delhi has taken since its 4-day conflict with Pakistan, it is not anywhere near the only play that India's made. Over the last few weeks, India has announced that it's getting in on the rare earth metals game, stepping up mining operations that would inevitably challenge China's near monopoly on the trade of rare earth elements needed to fuel global advancements in tech and renewable energies. It's directly accused China of providing real-time intelligence to Pakistan during the recent South Asian conflict, and it's announced major pushes on military development and procurement, getting ready to spend at levels that would suggest it believes China and Pakistan to be a united front. Indeed, that does seem to be the case, with China and Pakistan growing ever closer, Pakistan touting its air-to-air successes against Indian aircraft using Chinese kit, and Pakistan positioning itself as a very convenient ally for China to keep India constrained and distracted during the decades of geopolitical competition to come. Against the backdrop of rising tensions, it might come as a surprise that Narendra Modi's next step, as it relates to China, will be to pay a visit. But that was the news that made headlines on the day after India and the Philippines signed their new strategic agreement, with Indian sources in the global press that Modi will visit China at the end of this month, in his first visit to China in more than 7 years. But as India moves to orientate itself toward competition with China, it's important to emphasize that the two countries' relationship isn't going to be black and white. China and India are both important members of the BRICS organization. They share an extensive bilateral trade relationship, and they have to live side by side along a 2,000-kilometer shared border. In fact, they just reopened official channels last year after a 4-year freeze that followed a border clash in 2020. These are two nations that, in practical terms, can't just ice each other out and start a Cold War like the Soviets and the Americans could during the 20th century. But what they can do, and what India especially appears to be trying to do, is ensure that when dignitaries like Narendra Modi visit China, they meet with their Chinese counterparts as equals. At a moment when China appears as if it's decided to prop up Pakistan in the long term, it's more important than ever for India to show that it's not just acting as a counterweight to Pakistan, but as a fellow rising power that China would be wise to respect. Right now, it's more important than ever that India strikes that balance, and does it fast. At the same time that India is working to present itself as a legitimate rival to China, it's dealing with serious upheaval coming from its partners in the Western world, and particularly the United States. On the 6th of August, the same day that Indian sources leaked Modi's upcoming China visit, Washington under Donald Trump slapped a 25% tariff on Indian goods, in addition to pre-existing tariffs that will combine to impose duties as high as 50% on some goods. Trump's rationale for the decision was to punish India for its ongoing policy of purchasing Russian oil, despite an international sanctions regime meant to cripple Russia's economy as penalty for its invasion of Ukraine. In practical terms, however, the decision by Washington puts India in a very difficult position. Not only is the United States India's largest export market, meaning that India now faces a severe economic threat imposed by a strategic partner, but the decision represents Trump turning his back on what had previously been a very close relationship with Modi. Of course, there's still a distinct possibility that the Trump administration will reverse its decision before a late August implementation date, but that decision has already been made. Washington's conduct is especially insulting to India, considering that other nations that accept Russian oil, particularly US adversary China, were not penalized in the slightest, while US ally India got shafted. The US made that choice while welcoming Pakistan's highest-ranking general and de facto leader to Washington, while giving Pakistan clear favor in a bilateral trade deal that is far better than India's. On top of that, India and the US only just wrapped up 5 rounds of trade negotiations that seemed to be going quite well, with Indian leaders telling the national media just last week that they were hoping to cap tariffs at just 15% and expecting Trump to announce the deal several weeks ago. Worst of all, it was just a couple of years ago that the United States was encouraging India to buy Russian crude, even despite the sanctions regime, as long as it abided by certain rules. Under Biden, India's purchase of Russian oil was seen as a way to make Russia dependent on India in hopes that India could either demand lower prices and cut into the Russian economy, or use its willingness to purchase Russian oil as a bargaining chip to extract concessions. While for American audiences, it might be natural to assume that Biden-era policies would be discarded under Trump, that's not the case for foreign partners who rely on stable, consistent American decision-making to guide their foreign and economic policy on a scale of decades, not just months. Zoom out, and it's been a less than ideal week for the Indian government, but it's also been a week that's made clear to New Delhi that the path forward should be one of its own choosing. China appears willing to accept a more confident, relatively equal India, even despite its clear preference for Pakistan. Despite its strategic value as an ally, the United States doesn't appear to be a trustworthy partner, reaffirming decades of Indian strategic autonomy and making clear that India would be wise to keep the global West at arm's length. It's probably not the situation that India would have chosen for itself, but after the last couple of months, and especially the last week, India knows where it stands. A rising geopolitical powerhouse charting its own course into the future. And just before we continue today, we're going to stop for a little bit of self-promotion. I'm so sorry. Have you ever found yourself watching Warfronts and thinking, despite Simon's 26 channels, I just don't have enough of that boy. If only there was enough news, everybody. Because we are at Warfronts are launching an exclusive new subscriber service, fronts.co. And yes, paid way too much money for that domain name. Every week you'll get a special extended edition of The Situation Room with an extra story tagged onto it, plus an exclusive full video that will never be released on YouTube. Our first is about what would happen if Russia and Poland went to war, how it might play out, and most importantly, who would win. But we've got others in the pipeline on everything from South Korea's awesome new tank to the videos that we'd actually prepped in case Kamala Harris won the presidency. You know, just in case you fancied a peek into an alternate timeline. It's not just extra videos. Subscribers will also get a chance to take part in AMAs, as well as access to our growing library of expert articles, which are designed to keep you up to date with the world of war. We have lots of guest writers lined up, from academics to award-winning journalists, all there to guide you through this increasingly apocalyptic world. And all of this, $5 a month, or just $50 a year. It's a bargain, ain't it, mate? Just head to fronts.co to sign up. There's a couple of freebies so you can try before you buy. That's fronts.co. And just I will note, because always happens, none of our current stuff is changing. Warfronts, all of the stuff that you get now for free, you will continue to get for free. This is just extra if you want to support us, which we greatly appreciate. And yeah, that's it. Let's get back to the video. Next up, we turn our attention to the African Sahel, and specifically the nation of Mali. There, not one, but two jihadist insurgencies run roughshod across the landscape, massacring Malian soldiers, regularly preying on innocent civilians, and building constant momentum that Mali has proved utterly unable to stop. But instead of providing an update on the day-to-day affairs in this conflict, which we can do fairly easily by just letting you know that Mali still isn't winning, we're going to talk about the return of the United States. To understand the relevance of the latest developments in Mali, we've got to understand a bit of recent history. You see, back in 2021, the military of Mali overthrew the country's civilian government in a coup, and two of its neighbors, Burkina Faso to the south and Niger to the east, followed suit shortly afterward. Rather than remain members of their regional bloc of countries, ECOWAS, the three nations split off and created a mutual defense pact, basically banding together in their shared decision to seize power by force. At the same time, the three nations disengaged with Western powers, who until then were working as security guarantors in the region. From 2014 to 2022, the nation of France, the region's historical colonizer, had led an international coalition in Operation Barkhane, an effort to combat the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, and other jihadist insurgencies. At the same time, and until their complete withdrawal in the summer of 2024, the United States led an intervention effort based in Niger with basically the same set of objectives. After the US, France, and their international partners were kicked out of the three military-led nations, they turned to Russia for support, first welcoming elements of the mercenary Wagner Group, then their nominal replacements from Russia's recently established Africa Corps to fill the security gap the Western nations had left behind. At the time, the whole thing was sort of a due to the legacy of colonization and exploitation of the Sahel region in an attempt by these military-led nations to show that they could stand on their own 2 feet as legitimate governments, while Russia took the opportunity to increase its power and influence on the global stage. But in reality, the results that the military regimes in Russia have achieved just haven't measured up to expectations. Today, the Sahel jihadist insurgencies, and especially the Al-Qaeda affiliate Jenim, are running wild, carrying out frequent mass casualty attacks on military targets in all 3 nations, and even targeting Russian paramilitary fighters with impunity. Rather predictably, neither of the 3 Sahel nations nor Russia have been willing to openly acknowledge that their work has been anything less than excellent, but they also haven't been able to stop the bleeding. As a result, the situation has continued to get worse, while Russia and its regional allies try to insist that all is well. So against that regional backdrop, it came as quite the surprise when news broke in late July that Mali had welcomed a delegation from the United States. A couple of weeks ago, Mali's foreign minister welcomed a senior State Department official and a collection of other dignitaries from Washington to the capital of Bamako. There, according to Mali's foreign minister, the US discussed Mali's ongoing efforts to fight Jenim and the Sahel branch of the Islamic State. The 2 nations explored the potential for renewed economic cooperation, including a possible surge of American investment, as well as the prospect of facilitating private US business ventures in the country. The US delegation stressed the importance of identifying and rooting out terrorist financing networks and raised the possibility of a renewed intelligence-sharing relationship to give Mali an advantage in its fight with the jihadists. It was the first high-level discussion on US military arrangements in that detail since the US and European allies were asked to leave the region. But although the meeting would seem to conflict with Mali's stated posture in opposition to the West and in favor of Russian backing, the visit by the State Department delegation did not happen in a vacuum. American figures who have been visiting Bamako since nearly the start of Donald Trump's second term, with a group of military legal representatives traveling to Mali in February for the first direct military engagement between the 2 nations in half a decade. Mali's foreign minister held a meeting with the US ambassador to the nation, also a counterterrorism advisor, earlier in July, reportedly to discuss how the US can support Malian troops with intelligence, logistical help, and training on how to recognize and deal with improvised explosive devices. And America's overtures have extended to Mali's military-led neighbors, with Niger's prime minister visiting Washington in April and accepting an ambassador in May, while Burkina Faso received an invite to a US-led conference between African defense leaders. In Niger and Burkina Faso, America's efforts have run into a bit of trouble. In the final days of July, the US stopped the processing of visas in Niger until further notice, without providing a reason other than the need to address unspecified concerns with the national government. In Burkina Faso, meanwhile, the US remains skeptical of 37-year-old strongman ruler Ibrahim Traoré, who's made a habit of railing against Western neocolonialism and imperialist ideals. Mali, however, is a different story, and as of right now, it appears that Mali's leaders are genuinely interested in pursuing closer ties with the United States. There are barriers on the American side too, with US laws prohibiting the government from providing military assistance to countries whose security forces engage in gross violations of human rights, which the Malian military has been credibly accused of repeatedly. But with Republicans in full control of American foreign policy right now, it's not clear that those legal prohibitions would be enforced in the near term, and if they're not, then a renewed bilateral relationship between Mali and America could come with quite a few important implications. First, there's the question of what Mali's choice would imply about its regional allies, Niger and Burkina Faso. The tripartite alliance between these military regimes has always been, at least partially, a matter of convenience. They all share a general dislike of Western intervention, they all faced intense international backlash for having overthrown their respective governments, and their neighbors battling the same transnational insurgencies simultaneously. They also chose to solicit help from the same international partner, Russia, giving them added incentives to work together. But the 3 military regimes actually don't have very much else in common. They've got fairly different visions for the future of their respective nations, and their common history comes with its share of old wounds. And not only that, but their attempt to band together hasn't exactly been a success. All 3 nations have suffered constant setbacks against their insurgent enemies, and while each of them have suffered their own individual failings, it's far more convenient for them to blame each other for failing to close porous borders and failing to uphold their end of the bargain of collective defense. And look, to be fair, those critiques are legitimate, going in every direction. Their shared goals of their recently established confederation, establishing common markets, creating new currencies and industry, and eventually forming a unified sovereign state, are going to be very difficult to achieve in practice even before they address questions of power sharing or collective decision-making to build a common future. For Mali to pursue a restart of its relationship with the United States without Niger or Burkina Faso coming along is a quiet but direct rebuke of those shared goals, making clear that the highest levels of Mali's government are skeptical that the Confederacy is headed for success. At the same time, Mali's choice comes with major negative implications for Russia, for reasons that we assume are pretty obvious. For the last few years, it's been Russia that was supposed to guarantee security. Russia that was supposed to be providing training, logistical and intelligence support in Russia that would help Mali defeat Janim and IS Sahel. But now, years into Russia's attempted collaboration with the Sahel states, the situation has only continued to devolve. Malian soldiers are now taking after the Wagner Group in their brutal conduct towards civilians, but they're not managing to defend bases or outposts against major jihadist attacks. The Wagner Group suffered numerous direct attacks, including a devastating defeat in the Battle of Tinzauaten in 2024, and it's now pulled out of the country, replaced with an Africa Corps contingent that's reportedly quite a bit less willing to do the dirty work that Wagner regularly engaged in. As much as the nations of the Sahel chafed under their prior arrangements with France and the United States, the government in Mali now appears to believe that it needs to re-engage with Washington despite the potential backlash from its own people and from its partner. For America's part, the move appears to be well in line with the second Trump administration's broader approach to geopolitics, engaging with regional leaders, no matter who they are or what they've done, in order to facilitate business deals, economic collaboration, and most of all, resource extraction. Mali is no slouch in that last department, with massive gold mining potential in southern parts of the country, plus major iron deposits, ample uranium waiting to be extracted, and smaller deposits of other lucrative minerals like lithium, manganese, and bauxite. In exchange, the United States would likely be quite happy to provide intelligence and logistical support, and could well engage in airstrikes to support Malian soldiers, as they've done in Syria, Somalia, and other spots around the world in 2025. Under Trump, the United States appears highly unlikely to send uniformed soldiers to support Mali on the ground, other than a potential detachment of Special Forces troops. But Trump comes with relationships to America's own private military contractors, potentially opening up avenues to supply non-uniformed personnel to support Mali's needs. Amidst the new push from the United States, Russia has stepped up its own efforts to secure its place in Mali and the wider Sahel. Right now, Russia is working to strengthen ties with Togo and Benin, potentially adding Togo to their confederacy of military-led Sahel states, while Russian delegations have engaged Mali in discussions on greater defense, energy, and mining cooperation in the last couple of weeks. But in Mali, as well as in the wider Sahel, Russia's growing problems don't come from the United States. Another Russian rival is looking to make its own mark on the Sahel, and that's Turkey. Over the last few months, Turkey has been working to position itself as a foil to Russia in the Middle East, Africa, and the Caucasus, a subject that we could probably cover in an episode all of its own. Let us know in the comments if you like that idea. In the Sahel, though, Turkey has been supporting states like Mali and Niger for years, including with the supply of military equipment and especially Turkey's affordable, effective drones. Mali has worked with a Turkish military training mission since mid-2024, with elite Turkish soldiers alleged to have embedded themselves within units loyal to Mali's leader, according to the outlet Jean Afrique. Turkey is already working to embed its own mercenaries in several African nations in a similar style to Russia's Wagner Group, and it can supply a lot of the same quality of military equipment that Russia can provide. Whatever offer the United States could make to Mali by itself, it could enhance that offer by bringing Turkey as a NATO ally and a nation whose leader, Erdogan, is becoming a closer and closer personal ally of Donald Trump. Any geopolitical realignment by Mali is going to take time if it happens at all, and to be clear, Mali's leaders could still choose to recommit to their prior course of action alongside Niger, Burkina Faso, and Russia. But for Mali to be welcoming African delegations to explicitly security-focused talks and openly acknowledging their willingness to collaborate with the United States as an international backer isn't something that happens by accident. If Mali is even starting down this path, then it's because today's alliances in the Sahel are starting to wear thin. Finally, we turn southward from Mali and travel just a couple of 100 kilometers to northern Ghana. As long-time viewers of the Situation Room already know, Ghana is not a country that tends to appear on this series, and certainly not as the primary focus of the segment. Right now, however, Ghanaian troops are streaming into the country's northeast, where a decades-long minor conflict is at risk of spiraling out of control. Travel to the very northwest tip of Ghana's territory, where its borderlands brush up against Togo and Burkina Faso, and you'll find the town of Borku, capital of the Borku Municipal District. The town is home to about 70,000 people, it's got a nice shrine honoring a historical tribal leader, and most of the time, it's a fairly quiet place. Unless that is the two dominant local ethnic groups are going at it again. The town and the surrounding area are home to the Borku chieftaincy conflict, which first broke out all the way back in 1957 between the Mamprusi and the Kusasi, rival clans that each believe they should be the ones to anoint a chief for Borku and the surrounding area. For today's episode, we're going to resist our own nerdy temptation to dive deep on the cultural history here, except to state that the two clans have been trying to live in proximity to each other for centuries, but share very little common ground. Their divisions have been made deeper by old colonial systems which attempted to identify local administrators in areas like this by essentially putting a friendly tribal leader in charge. That's not exactly a great system in places with ethnic or tribal divides, where the leader of one tribe is elevated to the head of the local government and thus gains power over all of the other tribes. But the system is still in place in this part of Ghana, and since that's the way administrative leaders are chosen, it is the system that both the Mamprusi and the Kusasi have to try and navigate. Over the last several decades, the chieftaincy conflict has followed a mostly predictable rhythm, where the position of chief of Borku becomes vacant. Both the Mamprusi and the Kusasi want their respective guy to take over the post. Both of them present their own justifications for why their guy should become the chieftain. One of them ends up getting snubbed, and the situation often devolves into violence before peace can be restored. Generation after generation of that cycle has led to a deep bitterness and mistrust between the two communities, and when disagreements arise in the modern day, violence is the expectation. The 21st century had seen several rounds of fighting with a cumulative death toll that's climbed well into the hundreds. In 2024, dozens of people died in the fighting after yet another chieftaincy dispute erupted, setting the stage for the flare-up that's happening now. According to local media, the origin of the ongoing round of violence came midway through the month of July, when a local gunman killed a Kusasi chief who served double duty as a local administrator. Gunman also killed 3 teenagers at a pair of local high schools, with those teenagers also being part of the Kusasi tribe. One of the teenagers was dragged from his dormitory and executed, according to local sources, while the other 2 appeared to have been deliberately targeted. Ghana's ceremonial ruler, Osei Tutu II, attempted to mediate the situation directly, but those efforts were unsuccessful, and violence between armed members of the Kusasi and Mamprusi tribes began to spread rapidly through the area. Ghanaian soldiers surged into the zone in an attempt to restore peace, implementing curfews and swelling deployments to unspecified numbers. Right now, however, tensions remain sky high, with no clear way to ensure that fighting won't just begin spiraling again once federal troops leave. Now, at this point in the story, it would be entirely fair to ask just why we're choosing to discuss what's ultimately a small-scale dispute, but we do have a certain method behind our madness. In isolation, the Borku chieftaincy conflict may not seem like very much to people other than the population that's directly impacted by it. But it comes at a time when it could have far-reaching security implications for the whole country of Ghana. And that's important because Ghana is one of the last parts of the Sahel to still be mostly exempted from the conflict we explained in the last segment, the growing jihadist insurgency of Janim. As we've explained in our discussion of Mali, Janim is at its strongest when fighting against Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. There, it's been able to inflict mass casualties on those 3 regimes' respective armies and take control of civilian areas where they can recruit fighters, raise money, and establish hard-to-track hideouts and logistical networks. Over time, Janim's offensives have appeared to move southward, putting the nations of Benin, Togo, and the Ivory Coast at increased risk. Ghana, however, hasn't been a target of Janim violence so far because for the insurgents, Ghana serves a very different purpose. Over the last couple of years, Ghana has emerged as a prime recruitment territory for Janim, where disaffected young men with few prospects are especially vulnerable to the pull of violent Islamic extremism. Ghana's borders are porous, especially along its northern territory where it touches Burkina Faso, and it's a prime location for Janim fighters to hide out, gather their strength, and evade detection before traveling back into Burkina Faso to carry out attacks. Janim has made Ghana into what the Africa Report called, quote, the nerve center for its organized efforts to steal cattle from farming and herding communities, convert those cattle into funds, and use those funds to support their insurgent campaign. All of this is feasible for Janim because Ghana's modern military is weak and it's badly under-equipped to handle an asymmetric insurgent threat when those insurgents use their territory to build intricate organized crime networks. Ghana's military has only about 15,000 active duty personnel at its disposal. Its army doesn't field a single tank and possesses less than 40 infantry fighting vehicles along with just a dozen meaningful artillery pieces. Its air force currently possesses no fixed-wing combat aircraft, although it's currently training pilots on a handful of Brazilian-made Super Tucano light attack propeller planes. The military is underfunded, undertrained, and undersupported by border guards and federal policing agencies, and stretched way too thin to be able to devote significant troops to rooting out Janim. And making matters worse, on the very day that this episode was written, Ghana's defense minister was reportedly killed in a military helicopter crash along with his deputy national security coordinator, the minister for the environment, and 5 other people. The defense minister, Edward Omar Bahama, had been the point man for Ghana's efforts to try and tamp down on Janim activity, making his death, if it's confirmed, a significant blow to Ghana's efforts in fighting the jihadists. It's against this backdrop of an overstretched, under-resourced military and an insurgent group using Ghana's territory at their leisure that we can return to the conflict in Borku with a little bit more perspective. There's never really a good time for a simmering tribal conflict to erupt into ethnic violence, but if there was ever an especially bad time for the Borku conflict to be flaring up, it is right now. Ghana has been cagey about the number of troops it's deployed to the northern hot zone, but in all likelihood, the number is at least in the multiple hundreds. The Ghanaian military, like any other in the world, can't devote 100% of its troops to a given cause at one time. Many of its troops are certainly going to be in training or working as support personnel or stationed in posts throughout the nation that always have to be on guard, not to mention members of the non-combat Air Force and the Navy, who probably won't be much help as peacekeepers in the inland north. Again, Ghana only has 15,000 troops at its disposal in total, meaning that it won't have that many troops or that much available equipment to siphon off to a crisis like this, even in ideal circumstances. And now it's having to pull critical troops away from the patrols, the guard posts, the checkpoints, and the other security operations that have been focused on keeping Janim from getting more entrenched in northern Ghana than it already was. Not only that, but the recent killings in Borku suggest that this round of violence is going to be especially bad when the barely restrained anger in the region inevitably spills over into active fighting. The deaths of the 3 high school students in and around Borku represent the deliberate, premeditated targeting of civilians as part of the conflict, despite violence usually being constrained to the adult fighters of each rival tribe. For civilian students to be targeted represents a far deeper sort of wound, and one that's likely going to be avenged in blood. Nor have peacekeeping troops been particularly effective in recent months. Smaller contingents of Ghanaian soldiers stationed in the area have failed to protect buses that have been ambushed despite being under military escort, and they've earned a bad reputation through some of their conduct this year. According to women, children, and elderly people speaking to the global press in March, soldiers have recently responded to flare-ups in Borku by targeting and beating civilians. As one leader told the b2w at the time, quote, "Men were attacked, women were attacked, old men were attacked, and even their limbs broken. Properties were damaged." That round of violence followed the killing of a military officer, but even still, Ghana's soldiers responded not by assuming responsible, level-headed command of the situation, but by coming after civilians. In the past, Ghana's soldiers have faced additional accusations of arbitrary detention and extrajudicial execution, while they're routinely accused of bias and discrimination by both the major tribes in Baku. Worst of all, Janim almost certainly knows what's happening in Borku. The regional experts fear that the jihadists are going to take advantage of that. They could, and likely will, seize on ethnic divisions that are exacerbated by the conflict, appealing to angry people who feel they've been disenfranchised by their government and offering them a way to express their fury. even if Janim fails to capitalize on the hatred boiling over in Baku, it almost certainly will be able to exploit the distraction of the Ghanaian government expanding their operations and taking advantage of the opportunity to be more mobile in an under-patrolled environment. And as this latest flare-up in Baku gets worse, as it appears likely to do, the government response will need to persist for longer and possibly draw in an even higher share of the Ghanaian military than what's already deployed. If that happens, then expect Janim to thrive in a situation that could result in the strengthening of Janim infrastructure in Ghana, the use of Ghana's territory as a launchpad for transnational attacks, or direct attacks on the nation of Ghana itself. Thank you for watching. See you next week. Further operations similar to how Russia invaded Crimea before attacking the rest of Ukraine years later. Located 48 kilometers from Taiwan, taking the Penghu Islands would likely prove more difficult. Considering the Taiwanese forces present on the rocky islets and the threat they would pose to the flank of a Chinese invasion force heading for the mainland, neutralizing these islands would be essential. While any amphibious assault on the Penghu Islands would be far smaller in scale than an invasion of Taiwan's main island, it would likely yield more valuable insights than a campaign against the Kinmen Islands. Alternatively, the PLA could choose to strike all Taiwanese-held territories simultaneously to reduce warning time for the main island. However, such an operation would be logistically demanding, requiring extensive coordination across its land, air, and naval forces. A multi-front assault could also stretch China's military too thin, undermining its ability to concentrate force where it matters worse, but never say never. According to this theory, after dealing with the islands, China would then turn its attention to the piece de resistance that is the main island. As mentioned, while the landing phase would prove extremely challenging, Taiwan's west coast appears to be the least worst option available for China. Regarding specific targets, it would be logical for the PLA to focus on ports, air bases, command centers, and urban areas such as Taipei, demonstrating the criticality.
If Xi Jinping has been purged, as rumors would have you believe, who's really controlling China? Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. You know, when I started China Uncensored over a decade ago, I never imagined there would be a day when everyone and their brother would be starting YouTube channels about China. Back in my day, the internet was nothing but cat memes and dirty videos. Now it's all about China and dirty videos. What can I say? I'm a trendsetter. But let's just say not all China analysis is created equal. Xi Jinping is going to be purged in 14 days, 52 minutes, and 35 seconds. It's actually pretty good. Maybe I should use it. But unapologetic clickbait aside, there are persistent rumors flying that Xi Jinping has lost power and been purged and replaced. A few weeks ago, I did an in-depth episode analyzing those rumors. Check it out for background sometime, but you don't need it for this episode. All you need to know is that some people think Xi has been purged, which is the first Purge movie I'd actually want to see. So I thought it'd be fun to look into how a communist dictator gets and stays in power. Don't try this at home, kids. Actually, no. Do try this at home. Let me know in the comments how it goes. So what do I look at to understand if Xi truly holds the reins of power over the CCP? It's whoever controls, as it's called in China, the pen, the gun, and the knife handle. In other words, he who controls the propaganda, the military, and internal security. That's China's vast network of police. Fun fact, the CCP spends more on internal security than the military, which just goes to show that the CCP considers the Chinese people the biggest threat to their power. So, as a communist dictator, your grip on power is firm if you control the pen, the gun, and the knife handle. It's easy to see why controlling the military and domestic security would be important. After all, Mao Zedong said political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. He wasn't a nice man. But propaganda is also a crucial aspect of control, and understanding that is key to understanding Xi Jinping's current position. Here's a good example. After Mao's disastrous Great Leap Forward, that was more of a 30 million people starving to death forward, he found himself politically sidelined. But because of Mao's control over the propaganda apparatus, he was able to sidestep the Central Party and launch the Cultural Revolution, which elevated Mao to communist godhood, while also plunging China into a decade of absolute chaos. And if you know anything about Mao's proclivities, you know it's the Nurgle kind of godhood. Propaganda continued to be important even after Mao died. His successor was Hua Guofeng. If you're less familiar with that name, it's because he didn't last that long. Deng Xiaoping, despite being purged 3 times, quickly replaced Hua as China's paramount leader because he had the loyalty of the military and controlled the state-run media, promoted his political line. Now, let me tell you about a CCP leader who did not control the pen, the gun, or the knife handle. Hu Jintao. He succeeded Jiang Zemin, who had officially stepped down as head of the Communist Party in 2002. But Jiang still controlled the pen, the gun, and the knife handle either directly or through proxies he promoted. In fact, Jiang used all 3 for the cornerstone of his tenure, the persecution of Falun Gong. He wasn't a nice man. But so even though Hu was the party's general secretary for 10 years, he never actually had much real control. That was a problem for Xi Jinping when he came to power in 2012. So right away, Xi began his now infamous anti-corruption campaign. According to this recent report from U.S. National Intelligence, in the ensuing years, the campaign has investigated and found guilty nearly 5 million officials at all levels of government. And shockingly, a lot of them were Jiang Zemin's people. First, Xi went after internal security, purging top Jiang officials like Zhou Yongkang. In 2016, Xi started sweeping military reforms that again saw his people promoted and Jiang's people eliminated. But the propaganda side of things was a different matter. Folks, there's a lot more of this episode to come, but if you like this kind of deep dive into what's really going on in China, you've got to subscribe to my premium website, ChinaUncensored.tv. That's where you'll see episodes and live streams we can't put on YouTube. And if you want to support China Uncensored, buying a membership is the best way you can. It's just the price of a bag of coffee. It's ChinaUncensored.tv. So now that Xi had purged Jiang's people in the gun and the knife handle and appointed his own people, there was the matter of the pen, that is the propaganda department. Propaganda was still overseen by Jiang's people, Politburo Standing Committee member Liu Yunshan, and Central Propaganda Department head Liu Qibao. And it was very interesting how they worked to undermine Xi. They couldn't outright criticize Xi in state-run media. So in 2016, they did this. Ah, yes, the earworm that makes me want to recreate that last scene from the movie Pi. So if that seems a little over the top, that was the point. It makes Xi look like he's trying to start a cult of personality, which, ever since Mao did that, was verboten in China. I mean, all leaders want that for themselves, but they have to pretend not to want it. So subtlety is the name of the game. Xi was pretty quick to shut down the Xi Dada craze. When you're too cringy for Xi Jinping, that's when you know you've gone too far. Just a year later, these two were gone, and Xi had put his own people in their place. And ever since, Chinese propaganda just hasn't made me want to dance. Yao jia zhou jia, Xi Dada zhe yang ran. Anyways, what was I talking about? All right, Xi Jinping now had control of the party's pen. Boy, you could tell there were non-stop campaigns promoting Xi's personal ideology, the humbly named Xi Jinping Thought. And Xi Jinping made the front page of the People's Daily a lot, which is apparently just subtle enough. Frequent flyer on the front page of the paper? Fine. Catchy jingle? You've gone too far. Okay, so this sounds like a guy who's got a firm grip on the party's pen, gun, and knife handle. So why are people saying he's been purged and is imminently going to step down? A lot of it had to do with this article in state-run Xinhua from last year in 2024, titled Xi Jinping the Reformer. It was 10,000 characters long and supposed to be about all the reforms since Xi came to power. But it was actually pretty subversive. It talked about how Xi was, quote unquote, inheriting and promoting Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up policies. Now, Xi has been doing everything he can to distance himself. He isn't an inheritor, he's a trailblazer, or at least that's how he wants everyone to see him. The article also emphasized Xi's authoritarianism and ideology and portrayed that as a regression from Deng's liberalization. The take many had was that anti-Xi forces were using the party's pen to express their growing discontent towards China's core leader. And if that were the case, that would mean Xi's grip on the pen had slipped. Man, don't you just hate it when you loan someone a pen and they don't give it back and then use it to try to overthrow you? But the problem with that idea is that for all intents and purposes, Xi still has his people in pretty much all positions of power, including in the media. What's much more likely is that whoever wrote and edited the article had what's called low political awareness. In general, communists aren't known for self-awareness, which is why so many party members get purged. Remember, Chinese communism is all about the right level of subtlety, and that's really easy to get wrong. So the people who put out the article could have mistakenly thought that they were praising Xi by assuming that all the party leaders with their perfect and flawless vision for China are all internally consistent, not just a way for whoever's in charge to show off that yes, they're the new guy in charge. Deng and Xi are part of a tradition of glorious Chinese leadership. Of course they'd be on the same page. Communism is hard. So hard it's literally never been tried. That is how people get purged. And indeed, this article quickly disappeared. Xi's propaganda chief, Li Shuwei, probably missed the problematic article because everyone was too busy with all the propaganda activities going on for the third plenum, an important meeting of top communist leaders happening at the time. It is possible whoever wrote the article actually did harbor resentment for Xi, but that would be a one-off thing, because after this debacle, Li Shuwei seems to have tightened things up, which is why there hasn't been a repeat since, and also probably why Li Shuwei hasn't been purged. According to Sino Insider, a risk consultancy that specializes in elite Chinese politics, had Xi truly speculated, and there is an ongoing effort to ease him out of power gradually, then there would be a coordinated effort in state and party media to shift the CCP away from Xi's political line and promote something else in its place. That has not happened. Xi is still going strong in all party media. And not just there. In December last year, at a Politburo Democratic Life meeting on the in-depth study and implementation of Xi Jinping thought, Xi individually commented on each Politburo member's remarks and offered his guidance. It was not a meeting of equals. They had to submit